my name is Rachel Garat. I am a member of the Sierra Nevada AmeriCorps Partnership, and I serve the Sierra Nevada Alliance and Sierra Club Tahoe Area Group. So a little bit of background about Sierra Nevada Alliance. It was founded in 1993 with the goal that every Sierra ecosystem and community is healthy, resilient, and collectively cared for through thriving partnerships as a legacy for future generations. And this is accomplished by uniting people and communities through environmental advocacy and workforce development, and by providing resources like the SNAP program, which brings me here today. They aim to build a united conservation force to protect Sierra Nevada now and into the future. And a little background about Sierra Club. It's a collective of millions of grassroots change makers working together across the country to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. And this is accomplished through practicing and promoting responsible use of the Earth's ecosystems and resources while educating and empowering people to restore the planet. The Tahoe Area Group, which consists of over 1,200 members, covers the Tahoe and Truckee area with the mission to protect and restore Lake Tahoe and ensure the ongoing protections of the natural resources within the Lake Tahoe Basin. And we invite you to participate with these organizations by coming to our activities and presentations like this one, as well as our outdoor events. And we also encourage you to participate in our cleanup events, which will begin later this spring, and I'll share more information about our where you can find information about these events and a follow-up email at the conclusion of this presentation. And without further ado, I'd like to provide a little bit of background about our presenter this afternoon, Dr. Christine Sheppard. Dr. Sheppard earned her Bachelor's of Arts and PhD at Cornell, and her first job was at the Bronx Zoo, where she started as an intern and ended as curator of birds. She recognized that zoos deal with their buildings causing mortality of wild birds outside, while glass exhibit walls, windows, and handrails bring bird collision problems inside. So in 2007, Dr. Sheppard joined the board at the Bird Safe Glass Foundation as a science advisor, and she conducts basic research into the effectiveness of different patterns in preventing bird collisions. In 2009, she moved to the American Bird Conservancy as collisions program manager and recently published a revised second edition of her bird-friendly building design. She has created American Institute of Architects continuing education classes on bird-friendly design, helped create San Francisco's standards for bird-safe buildings, and was part of the team that developed the United States Green Building Council's LEED, or Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, Pilot Credit 55, Reducing Bird Mortalities. So I'll give the floor now to Dr. Sheppard so she can tell us more about her work, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to type your questions in the chat. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight, and I hope we can get the tech to actually work. American Bird Conservancy does bird conservation work throughout the Americas, and we do everything from creating reserves for the rarest of the hummingbirds to building the conservation community. I work at this level of our pyramid, reducing threats, and there are also people at ABC that work on cats, pesticides, and so forth. Just to start, it's useful to distinguish between things that people sometimes confuse. Okay, so some people confuse what is becoming to be called shadow boxing when birds attack their reflections with collisions. And this is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is when birds fly full speed into a pane of glass, usually either dying or becoming severely injured. Most of the time, shadowboxing doesn't injure birds, and ironically, the solutions that will stop collisions won't actually stop birds from attacking their reflections. So I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain to all of you why you should care about birds. I mean, birds have intrinsic values, they have cultural values. The latest whatever you call that thing that just got published on Monday, shows that about a third of the adults in the United States, state of the bird, sorry, um, consider themselves some type of bird watcher. And this generates almost 300 billion in economic value. So there are reasons all over the place for you to care about birds, besides the fact that they're just plain wonderful. Almost everybody has seen a bird hit a window or heard a bird hit a window, but most people believe that it was a rare event, that it was something that happened to them. They don't realize how often this happens for everyone to have had this experience. Over 1 billion birds a year are killed hitting glass just in the US and Canada. Most of these are songbirds. There are high peaks of collisions during spring and fall migration as birds are flying through unfamiliar landscapes. A little bit confusingly, most of these birds migrate at night, but most collisions actually take place during the day. You would expect, you know, if 1 billion birds are being killed every year, that you might see birds littered all over the landscape. And knowing a little bit more about this issue, you may start to see bird carcasses more frequently. But they can bounce into foundation plantings. They're often swept up early in the morning around buildings. And scavengers really love dead or not quite dead birds. They will actually stake out windows where lots of collisions occur. So studies of this have shown that carcasses sometimes can persist for a week or two, but often only persist for an hour or two. There's a very powerful urban myth that associates collisions with skyscrapers. And this is definitely not the case. Almost 50% of collisions take place on homes and other buildings up to about 3 stories. Most of the rest take place on low-rise buildings up to 11 floors. Less than 1% of collisions take place on high rises. The collisions that take place on high rises tend to take place on the lower 11 floors. This is because there's a very strong correlation between collisions and glass that reflects vegetation, and we'll look at that some more in a minute. So what is a bird-friendly building? It's pretty obvious that the one on the left epitomizes not bird-friendly. You can't tell the reflections and the sky from the real thing. On the right, you see what a lot of people think I'm going to mean by bird-friendly architecture. Fortunately for us, that is not the case. You can do a lot. You can do almost any kind of architecture that you can think of, and it can be bird-friendly. This is an example of a bird-friendly home. All of the windows have external insect screens. It's as simple as that. If you want to create a bird-friendly glass box, you can do that. This building in Mountain View, California, was constructed in a community that requires bird-friendly design. And they went with a glass that has just a narrow horizontal stripe. This is enough to deter most collisions. This is another strategy from Ithaca, New York. Both the vision glass and the spandrel glass on this building have extremely low levels of reflectivity. So there really are not reflections of vegetation and sky on this building. It helps to understand what's going on a little bit better if you think about the differences between human vision and bird vision. We're primates. We have eyes that are close together in our heads. We don't really have a beak sticking out between them. And we have very good depth perception. We tend to see the world as something that is in front of us, that we're moving into. Now think about how the world looks to birds. They have eyes on the opposite sides of their heads, so they're not seeing the same thing with each eye. They don't have much depth perception or 3D vision. They have completely different mechanisms for determining how fast they're moving. And presumably they experience the world as something they're immersed in. They're as interested in what is out to the side or behind them as they are in what's in front of them. Birds see many more colors than we do. They have a much more complex retina. Some birds can actually see out into the ultraviolet, although by no means all bird taxa can see UV. Birds can perceive the magnetic field of the earth. This is how they navigate while they're migrating. The one area in which our vision is actually better than birds is something called contrast sensitivity. Um, that means that something to us that might look like a field of dots to birds might just look like a blur. They can't distinguish between objects as well as we can from the same distance. People also tend to think that they can see glass, so they don't understand, what's wrong with birds. Why don't they see glass the way we do? People are injured every year running into glass walls and doors. The difference is that we learn about glass as a concept when we're young. We understand that glass is a solid substance that can look like a mirror or can be completely transparent. And because of that, you can do what they've done here on the left. You can put a row of decals on a glass door and people will understand that means that glass is there. Birds never understand this concept. They don't know that glass is a substance. To them, those decals are just something they might fly above or below. And if I take away the cues that you use to tell you where glass is expected to be found, you can't tell me if this is a picture of a tree, if this is a tree seen through a window, or if this is a reflection of a tree. When I show you this, you understand that glass has to be involved somehow because you can see a crack, but you still don't know if we're looking through a window or if we're looking at a reflection. It's only when I show you this that you understand it's a reflection. Birds don't understand that right angles aren't part of nature. They don't understand any of the cues that you use to tell you this is a reflection. To birds, reflections are reality, and they're just as likely to try to fly straight to a reflected tree as they are to a real tree. They may also try to fly through one or even multiple panes of glass to get to habitat seen on the other side. This is the Ford Foundation atrium on 42nd Street in Manhattan. There are more trees or shrubs in this atrium than there are for blocks in either direction. So if you're a bird that has come down after a migratory stage and the sun comes up and you're looking for resources, you're looking for greenery. And this is where you're going to head. This building actually does have a severe collision problem during spring and fall migration. Artificial light at night is another piece of the problem. Light attracts birds into the built environment so that they're found there at a higher frequency than you would expect if they were simply coming down randomly. Birds can be completely caught by powerful beams of light that exist against a dark background. What you're seeing in this image here is the 9/11 memorial lights. These are very, very powerful beams, and birds get trapped there and circle. Luckily, when the memorial was first designed, the New York City Bird Alliance basically made a deal so that whenever the monument is lit, volunteers stay up all night on the roof. And when birds are trapped like this in the beams, they make a phone call, the lights are turned off, and the birds are released. We used to see things like this more frequently. Back in the 40s and the 30s, there were big collision events at places like the Statue of Liberty and the Washington Monument. Now it's rare that there's a bright enough light against a dark background for something like that to happen. It tends to only happen in really bad weather, like the McCormick Place collision event that happened 2 years ago. Light pollution is so widespread This doesn't mean, however, that birds aren't being affected. They're being lured into these huge, brightly lit areas. This is Houston, and its light footprint is larger than the state of New Jersey. Um, Obviously, simply turning out lights is going to be a difficult thing to do because you need to turn out so many lights over such a wide area to really make an impact. When people first started working on collisions, the people doing it were volunteers that loved birds. They weren't trying to do science. They were trying to document a problem, to get people to pay attention to it. And they were trying to rescue the birds that weren't dead yet. We really only started seeing science done around collisions maybe 15 years ago with the work of Dr. Dan Clem. What we've seen over and over again since then is a very strong correlation between the amount of glass on a facade and the number of collisions, and between the size of panes of glass on a facade and the number of collisions. We also have seen many, many times a strong correlation between glass that reflects vegetation and glass that causes collisions. Another thing to look at, though, is the habitat that birds are flying through. When birds are flying through open sky, and they do this a lot, they're flying towards blue or gray or misty clouds. Their attention is not necessarily focused on where they're going because they don't expect anything to be there. Their focus is in front, but also to the side and to the rear. Now, when they're flying through a cluttered environment like the one on the right, you can bet that their attention is where they're going. They're focused on the gaps between the twigs there. They're trying to see if they can fit through those gaps or if they need to fly around. And this is the basis for the way that we deter collisions. There's some really interesting work that's been done in the last 10 years that shows how well birds understand their body size. They can judge the size of an opening to within about an inch of their wingspan. So they know if they have to clamp their wings to their side to fit through a gap, or if they have to put their wings above their head, or if they can keep flapping. So what we do is we try to convince birds by putting patterns on glass that they are faced with complex environments that are too dense for them to fly through. So we're signaling birds with patterns. And patterns are basically a combination of visual elements. The birds are less interested in the visual elements themselves than they are in the spaces between them. What we've discovered is that those elements should be spaced no more than 2 inches apart if we're going to really stop collisions for the smallest birds, which includes hummingbirds. The patterns need to contrast with the glass, with whatever is reflected on the glass. The elements have to be large enough for birds to perceive them. This is where this contrast sensitivity comes in. Lines should be at least 1/8 of an inch in width. Dots should be at least 1/4 of an inch in diameter. But by no means are we saying that you can only use dots and lines. We actually encourage people to be more creative because arrays of dots and lines to birds, can look like a blur. All of these things are best done on the outside surface of the glass. And I will show you why that is in just a second. Glass is very reflective, as you know, and it doesn't need to be a mirror in order for a reflection to make what's behind it invisible. So here on the left, we have a mirror that's just reflecting a pattern of stripes. In the center is glass that is only 34% visual light reflectance. So only 1/3 of the light that hits that glass is reflecting off it, but you can see there's a very strong reflection on that glass. It's only when you get below 15% that we think that patterns on the inside of the glass um, actually are going to show up a reasonable amount of the time. This is actually one of my own windows, and you're not looking through it, you're looking at a reflection in this glass. The glass has black, gray, and white stripes on the outside surface and on the inside surface of the glass. You can see that black, gray, and white all show up quite well on the outside surface, but on the inside surface, all three colors tend to disappear, especially the gray, but even the white and the black. So patterns work much, much better if they're on the outside surface. There are other factors that can contribute to whether or not a pattern you develop is visible to birds. Here, we've got sets of double lines that increase in width, moving from left to right. And you can see that the narrow lines are somewhat visible against solid blue, but against the complex green vegetation, they tend to disappear, with only the wider lines becoming visible. From the left picture to the right, the stripes go from translucent to opaque. And you can see that the widest opaque lines are the ones that show up the best. But there's room for you to sort of play around with a design here with all of these different factors. Patterns can be three-dimensional. I mentioned insect screens before. There are much more complicated screens that people install on the outside of buildings, largely as sunshades. These help control movement of light in the building and also help control heat and glare. So what is bird-friendly design? Bird-friendly design starts the very minute you start thinking about a building. It's not something that happens after a building has been designed. Over and over again, people have sent me pictures that they cut out of a newspaper saying, this building was just announced. Well, by that time, the building's been designed. It's almost too late to make any changes. In order for bird-friendly design to really work and to be cost-effective, birds have to be taken into account very early on in the design process. Here's a building in Salt Lake City that actually has used three different strategies. They have a glass that is marketed to be bird-friendly. It's got a UV pattern on it. There are louvers on some of the windows and insect screens on the others. It turns out that all glass buildings are not energy efficient, even the ones that have gotten LEED ratings. Once you get above 30 to 40% glass on a facade, and this obviously depends on where you are in the country, you start to increase your heating and cooling costs. So starting a bird-friendly design simply with the sustainability goal of reducing your energy costs is a great way to do bird-friendly design. You can also reduce exposure of glass using some of those three-dimensional elements I mentioned. You can use glass that is manufactured with signals on it. And there are many technologies that allow you to do this. You can use ceramic ink. You can use acid etching, and now people are doing laser etching. There are technologies that allow you to actually print on glass. You can use ultraviolet coatings that birds see that we don't. We're starting to see photovoltaic bird-friendly glass, and people are trying to come up with new ideas all the time. When I first started doing this, there was virtually no bird-friendly glass being manufactured anywhere. Now, globally, almost every glass manufacturer wants to have a line of bird-friendly glass. And there's a lot of overlap between bird-friendly design strategies and sustainable design strategies, as well as security and privacy. So there are lots and lots and lots of decisions that are made throughout the design of a building. What you want to ensure is that when a decision is made, you go with the bird-friendly one. And it's not just buildings, it's also auxiliary structures. Um, Building connectors are often singled out as being particular causes of collisions, but there's quite a literature now showing that bus shelters kill large numbers of birds. Highway noise barriers are particularly bad, glass wind walls, and so forth. All of these are very easy to make bird friendly, however. There are some misconceptions that you'll still find on the internet. These are based on ideas that people had 20 years ago. One of the things I found out when I first started doing this job is that most of those recommendations actually were wrong. Um, People thought that north and south facing facades would kill more birds because of that association with migration. That doesn't turn out to be true. Birds come down in the dark, and during the day, they're flying all over the place. They're not flying north and south. So you get collisions on all sides of buildings. Overhangs, you can see these overhangs here and these reflections. Overhangs were thought to be something that would stop reflections and stop collisions. Definitely not generally true. There was an idea that angled glass, like you see here, this is the New York Times printing plant near LaGuardia Airport in New York, that angled glass would stop collisions. That turns out not to be true. And I already talked about why signals from inside are not really reliable. You can't always see them from the outside. So sometimes you'll walk by an office building and you'll see blinds like this partially open. If you look at it from a different angle, you lose that illusion of a stripe pattern. And at other times of day when the reflection is stronger, you may not see it at all. One of the things that ABC has been doing is evaluating glass. It turns out that architects like to have rated materials. And this was something we figured out way back in sort of 2009, 2010. I had, when I was still at the Bronx Zoo, discovered this technology, which is called tunnel testing. It was developed by Martin Rusler, a bird biologist in Austria, in an attempt to deal with particularly those highway noise barriers I was talking about. The American Zoo Association gave me a grant to build a tunnel like this. And I brought it with me when I moved to ABC. This is actually our second tunnel. We have one outside of Pittsburgh and one at Washington College. And this is more or less how it works. Both of these tunnels are at banding stations. Some of the birds that are banded, but not all of them, are brought out to the tunnel. It's dark inside this contraption. They're placed in the tunnel through this sleeve so it stays dark. We've got a video camera that films every flight. And this is what it looks like to the bird. They have their choice of flying out to the left or to the right. We've got a clear control panel and whatever the pattern is that we're testing. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that there's a piece of a mist net that's stretched across the end of the tunnel. So the birds are never actually injured during this type of testing. They make one flight through the tunnel and then we open a door and let them out. The more birds fly toward the control, the more effective we think that this pattern is. And we fly 80 to 100 birds for each of the patterns that we test. And we assign what we call a threat factor, which is really just the percentage of birds that fly to the pattern. So if 3% of the birds fly to the pattern, it would have a threat factor of 3, and it would be considered a very highly effective material. This is what it looks like. That's all there is to it. We let the bird out and off it goes. The same piece of glass can look totally different at different times of day, at different heights on the same building, on different walls of the same building. We can't capture all of that variety in a single number. Our threat factor is simply a way to compare different materials under more or less standard conditions. We're not trying to mimic reality in some way. One of the things that being able to rate materials has helped with is passing legislation requiring bird-friendly design. And this is a partial list of the places that have done this. San Francisco was the first in 2011. But since then, all across the country, at the city level, at the state level, at the county level, people have passed legislation requiring some level of bird-friendly design. Many of these pieces of legislation differ in their details, but they have many things in common. They encourage a reduction in the amount of dangerous glass. They encourage the use of bird-friendly glass. If they don't cover the entire building, they focus on the lower floors where you get the most collisions. They include renovations where most of the glass on a building is being replaced. New York City has passed the most stringent legislation. They did this back in 2019, and it went into effect in 2020. So we're just starting to see the first buildings built under that legislation be ready for occupancy, which is very exciting. They require that 90% of the glass up to 75 feet have a threat factor of 25 or less. And this includes every building in New York City, from a single family home in Staten Island to a skyscraper in Manhattan. And as Frank Sinatra says, if you can do it in New York, you can do it anywhere. And we're seeing more and more places be interested in passing this kind of legislation, partly because they're seeing that it isn't causing problems where it's been implemented. People aren't spending a lot of extra money on this. They're not building ugly buildings. It's working just fine, which makes me very happy. Now I'm going to run through some of the types of glass that are available for constructing new buildings, and then I'm going to look at retrofits, how you can make existing glass bird friendly. This is a dynamic glass. Depending on how bright the sun is, it can be a mirror or it can be completely transparent. But because it has those etched boxes on it, it's always bird friendly. Fritted glass uses ceramic to create patterns. This is the fritted glass that we saw on the Intuit building in Mountain View. And you can see that you still get a good view of the outside. You're not really having to give up your view to save birds. This is a different kind of fritted glass. It has a lot of dots, which gives a matte looking surface on the outside, making it bird friendly, but from the inside, you can still see out. This is a lot like bus wrap, and we'll see that again in a bit. This is a glass produced in Germany that's distributed by Eastman. It's a three-dimensional metallic sequin. It's highly reflective, and it's a little bit wavy so that it sort of twinkles. But from the back, the dots are black. So when you're inside looking out, you honestly don't notice them. From the outside looking in, however, they're very, very visible to birds. There are quite a few buildings that have started using this in Europe. There is a technology that many local glass companies have begun to purchase, which allows you to print just like a Xerox machine on glass. This means that architects can source custom glass patterns much more easily without having to order enough for a giant skyscraper, which means that smaller projects can be more creative in making things bird friendly. Acid etch. Walker Glass in Canada was one of the first companies that started to make bird-friendly glass, probably back maybe in 2007. So they've been doing this for a long time. The glass pattern on the left is probably their most visually intrusive one. On the right, there's a pattern of etched dots on that glass. You really can't see it very well. Now, these glasses would have different threat factors. The glass on the left would have a very low threat factor. The glass on the right might have a threat factor closer to 25 or 30. Other types of etched glass. I mentioned solar. On the left, those are solar cells that can be placed on the windows with proper spacing. But the material on the right, that brown wall, is actually also a photovoltaic material. We're starting to see photovoltaic siding that you can use for your home. So there are a lot of different types of material starting to be available that are bird friendly. There's been a very strong interest in ultraviolet glass. And ultraviolet glass is sort of the typical double-edged sword. It doesn't work if you just have a UV absorbing or reflecting material spread across the glass. You have to have a pattern. So it won't work to go out and get some of those solar films that are designed to stop your furniture from fading. In fact, some people have reported that those increase collision numbers. The problem with UV is that there's less ultraviolet and sometimes no ultraviolet in the early morning or on overcast days. So ultraviolet is probably going to work much better in Phoenix than it does in Portland. Not all birds see ultraviolet. That said, there are products that do deter collisions that use UV patterns. And I wouldn't expect the Sierra Club or the Audubon Society to build a building using ultraviolet glass. But this is something that is very often selected by more commercial developers because they're more concerned with people seeing the patterns on the glass. Here are two examples in New York. On the left, that's Guardian Bird First. You can still see a subtle stripe on that glass. From the inside, though, it's totally invisible. Ornalex Mikado on the right, it has a kind of a spiderwebby pattern. Again, invisible from the inside, not very visible from the outside. ABC's been working with a shading specialist at Carnegie School of Architecture. She has actually created algorithms that will generate bird-friendly patterns with the proper spacing and so forth. But you can tweak the algorithm to make things that look biological, that look fractal. We've produced a document that has 50 of these. It includes the programming language and renderings as well as the patterns themselves. So we're hoping to find architects that are willing to think of bird-friendly design as something to actually make a focus of, not something that you're trying to get people not to notice, but something that you want people to notice. Retrofits. Feather friendly is right now one of the most frequently used retrofits. They make vinyl patterns that go up like a window film. You pull off the backing and the dots or lines stay on the glass. So here are two of their patterns. They're highly effective. If you have been following what's been happening at McCormick Place in Chicago after that 1,000 birds were killed in one night, they have put feather friendly up on all of their glass and have reduced collisions more than 95%. So feather friendly also has kits that you can use to do home windows with. So this can be applied commercially, or you can do it yourself. Solix is a company also called Decorative Window Films, and they produce a line called Bird Safety Films. Here is one on a handrail at the Bronx Zoo. This is an extremely effective pattern that people don't seem to notice very much. It seems to be easy to look through horizontal lines where dots take more of your attention. Here it is installed on a building at Northwestern University. From across the street, you can't see that it's there, but the volunteer monitors that have been watching this building report watching birds fly towards these windows and then veering off. So it's been highly effective as well. This is one of the first solutions that was marketed as a retrofit. You may know it as bus wrap if you've ever ridden a shuttle bus at an airport out to the parking lot or to a rental car. Or frequently, if you go and get your car serviced, you'll notice there's material that from the outside looks like advertising, but from the inside you can look out. So there's a lot of this white version has been installed. As I said, you can put designs on the outside. This is a community college on Cape May in New Jersey, and they had a terrible collision problem because they were very reflective windows. They actually covered 100% of their windows with Kaleidoscape, and it's reduced their heating and cooling costs. It stopped their collision problem. And the students actually started using the space inside the building that used to be too glary. So it can be a good solution. There is also a product called Bird Divert. And this again is something that you can put up yourself, do it yourself, or that can be commercially installed. It's very difficult to see the dots. It's a combination of ultraviolet reflecting and absorbing dots. And it works very well, especially when it's sunny. Copian bird savers are another solution that has been around for a long time. It's basically paracord hung every 4 inches just in front of the window. The fact that it's hanging in front of the window and it moves seems to actually make it work well for hummingbirds. Usually we advocate for 2 inches for hummers. There are many, many ways that these can be designed and installed. And again, you can do it yourself, or you can contact the company and they will make them for you. External insect screens make windows extremely bird friendly. They eliminate the reflections and act as a trampoline if a bird does hit. Motorized sunshades also are a really good strategy. This, at the zoo, we used to have glass handrails in the exhibits, and we couldn't cover them up during the day. But during the day, there were people there, and the birds usually weren't colliding. We could just throw tarps over those handrails at night. Well, you can do the same thing with your living room. You can have a solar shade that's up when you're there, and that you put down for the rest of the time. Since many, many collisions happen early in the morning when you're probably not there using those windows, this can be a really good solution. This was my old house, and I got that sunshade on sale at Costco. Netting, there are people that have used netting successfully. This actually is the FBI headquarters in Chicago. Netting has to be monitored. It has to be kept taut so that birds don't get tangled in it. It has to be kept without holes so birds don't get trapped behind it. So it's not something that you could simply install and just ignore, but it is successful in many places that have used it. I'm a big fan of paint. If you want to do something quick and dirty You can get a quart of tempera paint at Michael's for $1.98. Look at those windows on the left. Those are my windows, and I just zipped those stripes on there with a sponge one day. I had moved in about a week before, and suddenly two robins hit my window in 20 minutes. So I just went out and did that. Um, Tempera will actually last. Amazingly enough, even when it rains, it'll last easily for a year. You can do designs that are much more sophisticated than just three stripes. In the center, that's paint put on with a stencil roller. At the right, this is a mural done at the University of Vancouver using a template and oil-based pens. There are quite a lot of art projects at colleges and universities happening using these different strategies. And it's an easy way to get people accustomed to the idea that bird friendly isn't bad. Decals are probably the most familiar solution for most people. Unfortunately, you really need to put decals up with that same recommended 2x2 spacing. Most decal packaging doesn't tell you that. They'll show you a picture of a window with one decal on it. And everybody that works in collisions has had somebody tell them, I put up a decal and it didn't work. It won't work. You have to put up a lot of decals. Our decals are bigger than you have to have for your pattern elements. You could cut all of these maple leaves into 8 pieces and scatter them around the window, and they would work just as well. Bird tape is another option. Those are the same windows you saw before with paint on them, only now I've put bird tape on them. I am not a patient person, and I'm not a neat freak. So I have not put feather friendly on my windows because you have to line up all those little rows of dots. But I can do this. I can put a stripe of tape on my window. And they both work, so it really depends on what you want on your windows, because there is a solution for really every situation. If you're looking for resources about collisions, birdsmartglass.org is where all of our stuff is located. You have to remember to scroll down to find the menu button, but we have downloadable resources. We've got a gallery of different types of bird-friendly buildings. We have a database of rated materials. We have a lot of how-tos for talking to people that have bird killing buildings that you'd like to have stop that. We have suggestions for how to get legislation passed in your community. So there's a lot to find there. And that is it. So we're always available to answer questions. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have now.
Thank you so much. This was very informative. I see we have one in chat so far. Yeah, anybody feel free to type in questions as you think of them. Kaylee asks, do you see an equivalent problem of birds flying into the windows of parked cars?
That's not something that anybody has called to my attention. Birds definitely attack their reflections in side view mirrors. But cars kill birds, there's no question about it, but not usually when they're parked. And there is quite a literature on birds flying into cars while they're on the road. And there doesn't seem to be a solution, going faster, going slower. It's very hard to not hit birds when you're driving in your car.
I would like to know, do you notice a difference in how different bird species react to the window treatments? In your studies, do you notice if some kind of are more reactive than others, or is it all just kind of the same?
Um, It's hard to actually parse that. And it's something that, because if we make the windows safe for the small birds, it's safe for the larger birds. We don't actually have to know. I mean, there are definitely differences. We don't see swallows hitting windows, for example. And I really think that if you're a swallow and you're flying at a glass wall, you're very likely to pick up on wind currents, or something that tells you to change your trajectory. But if you're a thrush and you're flying like an express train, you're just not agile enough to make that shift. And we get lots and lots of reports of thrushes. So there are certainly species differences. But luckily, we don't have to worry about that. If we use that 2x2 spacing, it works for hummingbirds. It'll work for everybody.
I see that, and said that she uses window decals from the Wild Bird Center, but the package says to place them alone or in groups every few feet. So just confirm we should instead put them every 2 inches.
That's right. Yeah, this is, I mean, decals are okay, especially if you're doing it seasonally. And there are solutions that are easy to put up and take down seasonally, like paint. There are other solutions, like bird tape, that if you put it up, you're going to want to leave it up for 5 or 6 years, because that's what it's designed for. So, but this is a problem that we have with decal manufacturers, is putting that spacing on the packaging. So
She also asked, could you describe the screens you were talking about putting outside the windows of a house? Were these are just like your standard insect screens, or are there any specifics that people should be looking for?
it's just a standard insect screen. It works fine. The problem is nowadays, people put them on the inside. And that's one of those choices, as you're designing a building, that you can make. Are we going to have the screens on the inside or the outside? If you're thinking about birds, you're going to put those screens on the outside. I had my windows replaced some years ago, from windows that cranked open to perpendicular to the building. And I would get collisions anytime I opened those windows. And I replaced them with sliders that had screens on the outside, and it worked just fine. It was terrific.
I think you kind of mentioned this earlier, but noticing, have you noticed trends regarding window strikes during the time of the year? So if somebody were to, let's say, put paint on their window, or make those more temporary changes, what times of the year should they be more aware of
Yeah.
focusing on?
Collisions happen all year round. There are the two biggest peaks. The biggest peak is in fall migration, because that's when the most birds are in motion. In spring, there are collisions, but not as many, because what you have is the adults that have survived to try to fly back up to breed. There are smaller peaks when resident birds are fledging young. And in winter, as birds leave their territories and fly around, windows associated with bird feeders have very high rates of collisions. And that, if you're only going to make 1 or 2 windows bird friendly, the windows closest to your bird feeders are the ones that you should pick.
Anybody else have questions for Dr. Sheppard while we're here?
Well,
I also
thanks
have
for listening.
I mean, I'm curious, if you were to make another version of your bird tunnel with unlimited funds, what are there any kind of changes that you would want to make to it? Or if you could make like the ultimate
Oh,
bird.
sure. We tried some years ago to come up with a tunnel that would use an artificial light source, and probably a single species. We were trying house sparrows, so that you could run year round. And we just didn't have we didn't have the resources, not just funding, but design. I was probably doing it 10 years too early, because now you could do the light source with LEDs very easily. The thing that we were using weighed 70 pounds and hung from the roof, with chains. So it wasn't very flexible. But that, because there's such a demand right now um, from the glass companies to get their glass rated, that it's very seldom that we have a chance to actually answer a scientific question using the tunnel.
Well, if we don't have any other questions right now, we can start to wrap it up. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming today. I know I sure learned a lot and solutions that I can do. And thank you, Dr. Sheppard, for your time and for teaching us all about this today, and for sharing your work with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous in the chat too. So this was all very informative for us, and I'm sure we all can take away something to implement in our own lives.
That's the one thing about collisions. It's the only conservation issue I know of where you can learn about it and do something about it the same day.
Mhm. It can be simple. Yeah, and I'll send a follow-up email to our attendees, and we can I'll make sure to share the resources that you provided so people can look back on it and yeah, make sure they can learn more.
All right. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I know we're a little bit over 5 o'clock, so I can let people head out and have a great rest of your evening.